Hi, everyone, and welcome to Black in Focus. I'm Karen Toulon here at Bloomberg's headquarters in New York, and I am joined today by two professors who've updated a wonderful book of theirs. The professors Bell Smith and Stella Nkomo, and they're the authors of Our Separate Ways, Black and White Women and the Struggle for Professional Identity. We're going to be talking about why this matters to women, why this matters to all of us, and kind of what companies can do to help. Ella Bell Smith, good to see you. You're a professor at the Tuck School of Business, and you're a leading expert on gender and race. You're also the founder and president of Ascent, leading multicultural women to the top. And Professor Stella Nkomo, you're usually out of Pretoria. You're a professor of human resource management at the University of Pretoria in South Africa, and your work on race, gender, and leadership is sought out globally. Thanks to both of you for joining us.
Thank you for having us.
Well, I want to start off kind of at the back end of your book where we're talking about what companies can actually do, and then we'll reverse engineer and talk about why all of this is really needed, some of the real interpersonal reasons, right? And so, Professor Smith, we'll start off with you. Exactly what are you calling, why now, and what are you calling on companies to do?
To be accountable, to understand that they are missing a very special group in terms of talent, in terms of perspective, in terms of vision, and that somehow in 20 years, we have not made any advancement for Black and Brown women. And that's just unacceptable in the year 2021, particularly as our country becomes more diversified. And it's not that these women are not there. It's not that they don't have the education from some of the best schools in the country and from some of the best elite business programs in the country. And they're still not there. How do you make people accountable? How do you understand the structuralized racism that totally denies women the opportunity no matter what you're trying to do? The diversity programs as we know them today are not working to advance this group. You've got to come out with a different strategy, a different approach, if you will. You've got to have a different set of data in terms of why. I'm doing work with a company right now. It's very interesting. They really have all the best intentions in the whole wide world. So we get the numbers in terms of wage gaps, because that's the other thing. Who's being paid and how much? We find out about every group. They break down white women, they break down white men. When it comes to African Americans, when it comes to Hispanics, there's one lump group. And I say to the guy the consultant who is doing the equity studies, outside group, say, well, wait a minute, I need a breakdown of the men between the women and the men. We don't do it that way. We only look at African Americans. The way we approach this, how do you know that Black women might be getting undercut in terms of their salary if you don't do the right type of analysis?
Right. So Professor Nkomo, so what do companies do to Professor Smith's point? I mean, how do you build in that accountability? How do you build in that tracking?
Okay, well, first of all, is to be transparent. I think that's what she's saying. The tracking must be done. I also think you have to clarify who is responsible from the board down to the first level of management. Because what it's showing too is that Black women don't even get into the pipeline. Yeah. So that's the first thing. So you have to show people, look, this is how many people you have. This is how many people you lost. So metrics make a difference.
And what do those people look like?
Yeah. And see, this is one of the points we make, Karen, this intersection of race and gender. So your data has to be quite specific, just as companies do very specific data when they're going into markets or they're going into other countries. I think the other thing is keeping your eye on what's happening. And I feel like, frankly, there ought to be a standing committee on the board that asks the tough questions. And that data should be as specific as saying, look, we notice in this division, there are no Black women. There are no Hispanic women. Why is that? Or your attrition rate is too high. So that's part of it. The other thing is, don't treat Black women or Hispanic women as a lumped group. Eventually, moving people through the company, you have to customize their development. Make sure they're getting visible assignments. Make sure that you sponsor them. You say, hey, I think Stella has a lot of promise. I'm going to invest in her. And that's not happening. And I think too many companies think, let me just do a checkbox. We did a D&I training, and therefore we have done enough. So, it's going to have to be targeted. There's no two ways about it.
Can
So,
I add one thing to that, too?
yes.
When you talk about your standing committee on diversity, you should have more than one voice on your board that understands and is well educated and developed in D&I matters. And we don't do that. We want to bring them in terms of expertise on the external. You need to bring it in on your board so that you have somebody on your board, hopefully two somebodies, because I always say one voice doesn't get heard clearly all the time.
Mhm.
So to that end, during this year of racial awakening, we've had more companies, institutions putting in place measures, trying to hold themselves accountable, making pledges. The SEC's just approved a new role that all board-listed companies must have one self-identified woman and at least one underrepresented minority or LGBTQ person. Or explain why they can't do that. That decision is now facing a court challenge. Meantime, companies are becoming more transparent. Here at Bloomberg, we have a Bloomberg corporate tracker that breaks down the U.S. employee counts by race and gender across job categories for 37 out of the 100 biggest companies in the nation. And it shows that only 4 out of 37 have Black people in 10% or more executive or management roles. And for women, the numbers are even more dismal. So my question to you is, even if we do have quotas, and with this more transparency, is that going to move the needle? Is that enough to move the needle? Professor Smith, you're shaking your head no.
No, that's not. Because first of all, one single voice, there's plenty of research, starting with Rosabeth Kanner, that one single voice is not often heard. One single voice has to fight the tide and has to deal with all the stereotypes and cannot be the voice. So you need more than one single voice, number one. Number two, you really have to do a structural, as Stella was suggesting, a structural analysis. This business of having one or two, and I don't think anybody is talking about quotas. We have to find different ways of being accountable, because when you say quotas, everybody's, particularly in this historical moment, everybody's shackles goes up. So we have got to find a way to have parity, if you will, and find a different way of doing it. I wish I had an idea on that, but I don't. But that becomes very, very important. Will this get us where we need to be? No, it will not. You've got to figure out, and each company has to figure this out for itself. Okay, because culture is the issue. How do you change the culture? How do you create a culture where difference is tolerated? And we're talking a lot about strategy, but culture is the one that makes or breaks you.
So let's talk about culture. We've just received census data. Apparently, America is becoming less white, is becoming more multi-ethnic, more multiracial. If we look at the Black population, for example, Black American fell to about 12.4%. But if you do Black and another race, we're up to 14.2%. So I see here that we have Americans have identified themselves as mixed race, who've done that. That's increased by 276%. So my question to Professor Nkomo is, are changing demographics going to help shift the needle? The fact that that the population in general is changing, is that going to push things along?
Well, I don't think so. I think maybe in the long term, but the issue is power.
Yes.
So even though you might have more multiracial, more Black and brown people, if you look at the wealth gap, if you look at who controls financial institutions, the inequality in the US has not shifted. In fact, the inequality has actually gotten worse. And, so it goes back to the thing, Karen, even within companies, more representation doesn't equal a change in the racial and gender hierarchy in companies, because many of your Black employees are where? At the bottom of the hierarchy.
Right.
So that is the problem. It's the same thing with the data. My fear is when I saw that census report, it reminded of me, if people remember this, remember when the Hudson Institute report came out saying, oh, the workforce is changing. This is going to really change the face of companies and companies should manage that. And look where we are 20 years later. So changing demographics are not enough. I wanted to say something about
two things, quick things there.
Okay. We got a lot to say.
You don't want it, what this does is evokes fear, which is what we're seeing in backlash. We're losing our numbers, and as a result, we're going to be the minority. Again, that's connected to power. The other thing is understand that the numbers might be changing, but we live in a very segregated reality. It's not that we're living in an integrated reality. I'm in North Carolina, and I can tell you the schools are resegregated. The communities are segregated. Integration still is not where we thought it was going to be 40 years ago. We don't live in a fully integrated society. The only place where people really do come together, quite frankly, happens to be either sports or the workplace.
Right. And to your point, and that gets to the crux of the book, the front part of the book, which is human behavior, and that cultural mix. You point out that white men at leadership are more comfortable with white women, and that when you talked with women, you talked with hundreds and hundreds of women, part of your research, Black women identify as Black and as women. White women identify as being women. Can you explain why that's relevant and how that matters in the workplace?
We always want to make white men the bad guys. All right. Race, understanding race, how we learn about race is cultural. How our mother and our father and our grandparents and our communities taught us. White women and white men are raised in the same culture, quite frankly, in terms of learning about race and also gender roles. All right. So we have this expectation that, it's just the men, but the reality of it is white women have the same attitudes. They do not see themselves as having a racial identity. And quite frankly, if you look at the book, what's interesting, white women have empathy. Well, I'm so glad I'm not a Black woman. They don't recognize the racial identity and the privileges, if you will, for lack of a better word, the goodies that come from being a white female. And that doesn't make it easy for them to be able to connect with women of color.
Yeah, and the reality, Karen, you talked about Black women. What we found in the book, and I think this is important, that Black women see both race and gender. They see the inequalities in both. Mm-hmm. So they will be able, in fact, when you think about it, if more Black women came into leadership, they would have a bifocal view. They would see the interconnections. It should help organizations to make those connections.
Right.
And I think that this is going to be important to have that kind of entity. So how do we help people to be able not just to think about their own, identity, but to be able to see beyond that? So we say in the book, gender equality will never be realized fully unless you take racial equality into consideration at the same time. You have to do both. My fear is that white women could become the new white men. I put that in quotes, because their numbers are going up. I mean, you have the highest number of white women ever as CEOs on Fortune 500s. So they have a very critical role to play in leading in changing racial inequality. So we're hoping that white women will step up to that kind of leadership responsibility.
Yeah, in the book, you outline that there are stereotypes in the workplace that how white women see black women, how black women see white women, but you also call on white women to be co-conspirators.
Yes.
And I really love that phrase. Can you unpack both of those, please? How those stereotypes kind of play out in the workplace and how it might affect how two women might move through a workplace, a black woman and a white woman, and then how white women can actually not just be allies, but that notion of that co-conspirator.
That's a lot to roll in, but I'll try.
All right.
If you look at take Stella's granddaughter, she's at a camp right now, and it's an integrated camp. But she came home talking about sharing stories about how all the little white girls, want to touch her hair, and how one of the little black girls said, "You can't touch our hair," and so the journey begins in terms of the differentiation between girls. You also have to add class in. One of my favorite stories from the book is that if you take a poor black girl, sharecropper background family, mother sharecrops, father is gone, multiple siblings, she's the valedictorian in her school. Very, very bright. The principal comes to her home, visits the mother, tells her, "Your daughter needs to go to college. I'm going to send out the applications. I just need your permission to do it." The girl gets accepted into college. The church and the community make sure she has a wardrobe to pack, and off she goes. And they make sure she has money there. She succeeds. Poor white girl. Mother has died. Stepfather's an alcoholic. She winds up going into servitude because the stepfather doesn't want to deal with her. Hands her over to her aunties. Well, her aunties basically, she has 2 dresses, and her job is to make sure that all the aunties' children are well fed, dressed, ready for school, helped with homework. She sleeps in a cot in the kitchen. She has 2 clothes to wear. She is also the valedictorian in her class. She does not eat lunch with anybody because she doesn't have lunch money. And her principal tells her it's best for you to go get a job. You can't afford to go to college. The poor white girl learns, and in her leadership vision in mind, it's to help others. It's a developmental. It is to support others. And if you give everybody an opportunity, they can make a difference. The poor white girl learns in vision as a leader. Pull yourself up by the bootstraps. You got to do it all by yourself. Do not share anything about your background because that'll make you vulnerable and that'll make you stand out and you feel unworthy. You take these 2 girls and you put these 2 as now women in the workplace. How do they build a connection? Where do they get a chance to share their stories? And we talk about allies. Allies, you've got a choice. As an ally, I can say, I want to be involved in this. As an ally, I can say, no, this is not in my best interest. Co-conspirators, we're in this together. And I think we have got to find a way where women can share their stories, understand how each of them are vulnerable, the developmental issues they had to work through, the self-worth issues they have to work through to get where they are, and then to talk about, okay, how are we going to make a difference? And each one, for lack of a better term, have to have skin in the game. It's not, well, I choose whether I want to support you or I don't want to support you. I am with you till the very end. And whatever consequence you face, I'm going to face too. And I'm going to use my voice to make a difference. That's a co-conspirator. We need co-conspirators, not just with white women, but with men. Allies are not going to get us where we need to be right now.
And so we're back to what does the company do, right? Are we, Professor Nkomo, are we talking about the DEI role and creating classes or spaces within companies for people to actually connect? How is that conversation happening? If we're all, at the end of the day, we're coming to work to do work. We've got tasks that we have to do. We have deadlines we're trying to make, right? And we're in the midst of COVID. So how does that happen?
Well, we do have work to do, but you build the relationships in the work. I had a leader say that to me one time, and I thought it was quite revealing. So first of all, make sure that you do have diverse teams, because people do begin to understand and bond through work. I think the workshops are a little bit sometimes too artificial, and people don't really transfer it into the job. But if you give people permission that it's okay to talk about these issues, then you will have a difference. And I think everybody has to learn and take the risk of being authentic. I saw that some companies said, I think it was even the Employment Equity Commission even said to employees, don't talk about Black Lives Matter when you're at the workplace. That's the wrong thing to do. Allow people to talk about these things. But I think that the greatest way is to make sure you have diverse teams. And it cannot be a group of white people and one Black person, because the Black person will not feel comfortable in talking about who they are and sharing.
One story is not going to get it.
And one story won't get it. So this is, again, the reason for avoiding tokenism and the solo. We got to build that critical mass.
Can I also add?
I just wanted to add, too, the leaders themselves have to be willing to talk about the issues.
Yes. Can I add? Can I add one thing? While you think about all this being work, I think about Dylan McGee and the Makers Organization. I see women building those relationships at the Makers Conference. I see women when they step outside. Part about being a leader, being a woman in today's corporate world, you've got to take responsibility too for developing yourself. And I like the organizations that are now saying we are about developing true sisterhood. We are going to talk about these issues. We are going to be co-conspirators. I'm not sure that companies will be able to facilitate all that, but I do know that there are external resources for women to be able to develop those types of relationships.
And so as we wrap up here, and we could probably talk for hours, where do you see, you mentioned makers, but do you see some companies or some industries or some groups that are if not getting things right, are making progress?
That's a tricky question. That's a slippery slope, because I can name companies when we first wrote this book that were doing unbelievable things that are not doing anything now. The problem with that question is we want to highlight companies, and nobody gets a check in the box for consistent, continual work in this area. If they did, we would not be in this place. Okay? I think that's the wrong question to ask. I think we need to allow companies to be where they are and say, okay, we've got to start this time clock. Let's start moving. And companies are going to move at different places, but there's no top dog in this reality. There just isn't.
So companies that are that may be looking at their employee base and looking at their systems and thinking, gosh, we haven't really started yet. We're not nearly where we wanted to be. We mentioned COVID in passing, but that's been very disruptive. Perhaps creates an opportunity to think about new systems for all workers, for everyone to be able to come to work and be productive.
Karen, you're absolutely right. This is the right time. This is a new opportunity. It is a new day. And I think that's why our book is important, to be sure that the dynamics and the development and the strategies and the dismantling of internal racism, structural racism, and sexism is taken into account.
And very quickly, when you say that, it's putting people in traditional roles, having roles that you just automatically will think as being more male roles versus female roles, tracking people. That type of behavior.
People? Right. How do you reward people? How do you review people? How do you give feedback? How do you develop people? Okay, what's your mission? How do you live that mission? How do you create a culture that is not hyper masculine? Let's not forget that. You will not succeed if you're in a hyper masculine culture. How do you begin to think about that? And here's the other quick thing. Are you working internally or externally? Many companies want to check the box, particularly in the age of Black Lives Matter. Oh, we gave to all these organizations. We've done all these things. That's not developing your people in your own company. companies have to realize that it's not just the external that has to be done. They also have to pay attention to the internal and who's going to be accountable for doing it.
Okay. Well, I think that's going to have to be
the minorities on doing it. Do not do that.
That's going to be the final word. Our thanks to Professors Bell Smith and Stella Nkomo, authors of Our Separate Ways. Thank you both for a wonderful conversation. That's it for this week's Black in Focus. I'm Karen Toulon. We'll see you again next weekend. This is Bloomberg.
Thank you.